So Daniel, thanks for making the time today. We're going to talk about AI, artificial intelligence and strategy. And I wanted to sort of get you to picture a situation or a scenario. And obviously you have built your own organization up, but imagine you were starting afresh. You had some capital, you're ambitious, and you think, right, I now need to develop the best possible strategy I can, and obviously think about how I implement it in the coming weeks, months, and years. And you know that you have this fantastic technology, artificial intelligence in your pocket, as it were. Where the premise of this conversation really is, where and how far could artificial intelligence play in developing strategies and actually making them happen? That's the sort of starting point.
So a good question. So if I was to start again, I would make sure that I am architecting the organization in a way that allows us to capture data across all of our different activities, because what we're seeing at the moment are companies trying to create what are called digital twins. So a digital twin of their organization, essentially a fully connected visual of how their organization operates, that will then allow them to say, if I built an extra warehouse here, if I spent more marketing money here, if I lost this person, what impact will that have on my organization? And so what I would be doing from the very beginning is trying to architect myself for a digital twin, because what currently business leaders are doing is we're asking ourselves, if we built another warehouse here, if we lost this person here, what impact will that have on our organization? And I would argue it's too complicated for an individual to hold that in your head. And unfortunately, we've had to have people hold that in their head because there wasn't an alternative. But actually, AI can now run those scenarios. They can do those what if scenarios. They can play out what impact that will have on the organization, and they can start making recommendations about how to allocate resources to allow your organization to adapt more quickly to a changing world. So it's really about architecting yourself for adaptivity.
That's very compelling. That's very powerful. I mean, one of the points you made there was what I would call some form of optimization. I know some of the work you've done is optimizing, setting a target, and obviously artificial intelligence. And I've seen and read take your definition of effectively it has to have a learning element, it has to be intelligent, and it has to work to some form of objective. And I know there's different types of artificial intelligence within a broad umbrella, and I know it's not automation per se. I guess the question in strategy is there's strategies which sort of exploit, inverted commas, responsibly, sort of do what you're doing better, more effectively, getting higher yield and return on investment. And then there's explore strategies, looking at adjacent markets, new jobs to be done by customers. And I can see the potential in terms of the exploit, in terms of optimization. I could see a role in explore in terms of potentially looking at patterns of, I guess it could be things like customer frictions or customer needs that haven't been identified before. But my leaning, and I want to test this with you, is that AI could play more of a role in the exploit aspect of strategy innovation than the explore. Am I right, or do you have a?
You're absolutely right. You're spot on. It's still very much left to the human being to do the exploration. It requires creativity. It requires pulling in lots of different data sources. It requires luck. So many things that machines essentially don't have access to, and so you're absolutely right. Human beings are currently exploring the landscape, and you're absolutely right that technology and AI can then exploit that landscape. It's going to be more difficult. I haven't come up with a scenario yet where a machine is setting the objective. The machine is working towards the objective. It's trying to achieve a certain goal and adapting itself to achieve to that goal. But I haven't come across a scenario yet where the machine is defining that goal. And that currently is still left to senior leaders with respect to what products to go after, what the purpose of the organization can be, because they are very complicated things that just
in setting that objective, drilling down then on that objective point, when you worked with a great number of organizations, when it's worked really well, how have they, if you like, infused the knowledge, the capability of AI into that objective setting process? What I mean by that is, when I think about executive committees, well-meaning, highly capable, but if you ask the question of how many of people sitting around a virtual or physical table know much about either what AI is and isn't, what it can actually do, and the answer is often if you actually ask the question, they don't know very much at all, let alone having somebody who might have a badge of a data scientist or an operations person. And I know you talk about needing a number of skill sets in AI,
Yeah.
but when it's worked really well, how have they set the objective using the full knowledge and appreciation of AI in some of the clients? I don't mean you to mention particular client names, but are there any particular examples that you could talk about?
Absolutely. So I think the first step is admitting what you don't know, and you're absolutely right. Typically, the C-suite level, there isn't always a depth of understanding about these technologies, and particularly with AI, there's so much misunderstanding out there that in some respects it becomes common knowledge that AI is a certain thing when actually it's not. It's something very different to what people understand. So there's a misunderstanding, first of all, often of what problems exist within an organization, and then there's a misunderstanding of then aligning those technologies with those opportunities. So that the first piece is an education piece, and I think it's important to raise people's, particularly at C-suite level of understanding and cutting through some of the hype and the noise. That's the first thing. The second thing is that you always hear things like quick wins and KPIs, and typically those KPIs are oversimplified to a point where it's a couple of measures. But actually, when you're dealing with, for example, allocating staff for PwC, it's not just about maximizing utilization. It's about continuity. It's about minimizing travel time. It's about career development. It's like so many different things that you're having to take into account. Same with Tesco, which it's not just about delivering routes, they're delivering more groceries for them. It's there's a whole load of things you have to take into account. And unfortunately, when you start on a project, typically those KPIs are very, very shallow coming from above. But the practicalities is you're dealing with many things that are contradicting each other. So if I want to maximize utilization for PwC, I have to then compromise freeing people up to do training and or increasing travel time. And I think that there's a misalignment in those kind of oversimplistic high-level KPIs, and actually the KPIs that you need to be looking at on the ground. There needs to be a much better way of marrying those together.
No, you'd hope over time that once you've done that more granular work, that people at the top would over time learn and amend their KPIs. But if you had to use certain words and keep it clean, certain words to describe the capability of a typical executive team or a leadership team when it came to AI in the type of process you talked about, what words would you use?
I am deeply worried that over the past 4 years, CIOs have been told by their CEO, we need to do something in AI, go and build an AI team. And what happens is various different things happen here. First of all, the CEO, CIO don't understand what AI is. They also, what they tend to do then is to hire loads of data scientists to solve problems that are optimization problems. And so first of all, they don't understand the problem that they're solving, and they're hiring the wrong people to solve those problems, or they delude themselves into thinking that they can hire that level of talent to solve these very, very difficult problems. And in reality, if you really want to move the needle on some of your core competencies, if you're not sexy or if you don't have interesting problems, you're not going to attract the talent. So you've got to be really honest with yourself about how to attract that capability to genuinely make a difference in your organization. And this concept of quick wins, to be able to somehow spend 3 months and a few £100,000 to generate millions of pounds in your organization is I believe a misnomer. But you might get lucky, and it might provide some quick wins, but what it will probably do is create tech debt in the future. So for example, you might get somebody to build a model that makes some sort of prediction for sales, but that model is not built into an overall AI architecture that can then be reused across the organization. So you end up getting silos again across the organization. So I don't believe that quick wins are always valuable for the long term.
So in that portfolio or lack of portfolio, where in the future would you see, rather than being a sort of set of disconnected experiments, if you like, who should hold that portfolio of AI within an organization, or the application of AI?
In theory, it should sit between the CTO and CIO, but AI is such a game-changing technology or set of technologies that I think that organizations should have an AI architect. If I was being brutally honest, I haven't met a single person that I think is well, no, that's not true. There have been a handful of people that I've met that I think can really step up to that AI architecture role. A lot of the people I've talked to in industry misunderstand these technologies. Now, it doesn't mean that you can educate them and then they step into that architecture role. But I think that you need to have an AI architect.
You've got a very important person behind you.
She's she's currently emptying out all my pens on the floor.
All right. Well,
yeah.
I know the feeling. I guess coming back to perhaps your own organisation, I know you've done some very innovative things in terms of transparency and, as you say, collecting data across the organisation.
Yeah.
The simple question I ask myself is: organisations that have, if you like, grown up with AI is sort of this as a centre, this sort of, I'm mixing metaphors completely here, but it is the DNA of the business, right? So forgive me. I always ask the question, okay, in setting the strategy, so the direction of the organization, the capabilities you need to sort of focus on, and where you play, where has AI played a role? Is it that you've had people who obviously, like yourself, expert in the topic, knowing how it could solve problems, or has it gone even further in using particular tools to actually give insights that could actually inform the strategy? Where would it sit?
I think it's the former as opposed to the latter. There are tools out there that you would regard as being AI, although all they're doing is kind of scouring the internet. They're doing natural language processing. They're finding patterns that allow you, for example, to look at trends in the kind of the landscape. So if I wanted to see kind of what the current sentiment is around last mile delivery, for example, there are tools out there that allow me to pull all that together and say, well, there's an emerging opportunity over here. Maybe we should be moving towards it. You'd think that actually Satalia would be using tools like that, but we don't. And probably one of the reasons why we don't is because they tend to be very overwhelming in terms of they provide so much information that it's difficult for a human being to actually then make decisions. So I would steer more towards trying to automate certain strategic decisions as opposed to trying to give information to strategic decision makers, unless there's an obvious gap in that information. So if they're obviously missing some information, then you want to bring it to them. But it feels like most of the strategic decision makers that I meet are already maxed out in terms of their information overload, and what you want to do is actually automate some of it.
Since that automation point, sorry, please.
Which is what we're very fortunate, because Satalia does that. We make things more efficient through automation and obviously AI, but we then look to try to make processes more effective. And we're very lucky because in some respects we are our own product. By solving these problems internally for Satalia, we can then provide those solutions for others. If you're a different company and your goal is to sell ice cream, then AI is just a tool to enable you to do that. For us, it's who we are.
And I guess in terms of your credibility, in terms of actually practicing what you preach, if you like, is critical.
Yeah. Indeed.
I guess in automating and then applying AI, coming back to strategy, in effect, you'd have to codify perhaps more than I see already. Now, it's not if I see a strategy functions as whether it's the chief strategy officer or the corporate development process, and they will go through and I caricature the process, a sort of, as you say, screening and scraping insights, qualitative, quantitative sentiment, long-term, short-term, and sort of, and obviously try and identify opportunities, threats, risks, play some scenarios, and effectively craft some choices and trade-offs in order to work out different levels of the organization. But some of that is codified, but a lot of that is actually in the heads of some of the people, the sort of the experts, if you like. And I guess one of the thing I wanted to test was around the preconditions of automating and applying AI. You'd have to, I guess, codify enough of that process to say, this is the step, this is the input, this is the data that's required in order to identify areas for improvement.
Yeah, absolutely, and you're totally right. And so one of our clients is a large retailer, and they have a number of people in their organization that seem to be very good at forecasting sales. So they've got different models, but they've got this handful of people that seem to be quite good at forecasting sales. And so if you could, and that are then being used across multiple areas of the business that are for decision making. But I don't think you have to codify the whole thing, and I think so. I think I'm definitely agreeing with you. But what we could do is we could build something that codifies the prediction of sales, which then takes one of those elements off the table. So we and over time start to bring in all of these different experts that you then use that information to make decisions. You can potentially start to replace them with AIs. But
I guess you need a lot. You obviously need a lot of data, but you also need data and say insight in order to, I guess, identify a large degree of causality in a lot of it, because there's a lot of judgment of if I look at, I don't know why I'm using my hands, if I look at the levers in the business, right, and it's like if I pull that lever, what immediately happens? What are the sort of spillover effects? And I'm not suggesting there is a strategy machine that you could sort of feed and then press a button and out comes the answer. But at the moment, in some organisations, it is a little bit too much of guesswork and sort of trust me, I've done it. Surely it could go a bit further towards a more informed, I guess, experience view. Similar to innovation, if teams are running lots of innovation pilots and processes for products and sort of in the core organisation, there is a process for that in most organisations. Some's more sophisticated. If you could capture that learning and capture that process and capture the data along the way, given that's repeated a lot more than a big strategy process, over time you should be able to find the equivalent opportunities to, say, a supply chain optimization or equivalent.
Absolutely. And that's the whole point of the digital twin, is the digital twin connects all these different things and it allows you to highlight where the bottlenecks are and to run scenarios. And so I absolutely agree. There is one challenge that we are going to be facing because of COVID and around these approaches, which is it's not only now very difficult for humans to make predictions about the future that you then make decisions from, but it's very difficult for machines to make predictions about the future, because you've mentioned that you need data to be able to make predictions. And in some respects, historic data now is not useful for making predictions about the future. And there are two types of predictive model. The most popular one by far is what are called first order chaotic models, where you're able to predict the future based on the past. So you're able to take historic data, build a model, then predicts the future. I would argue that is not the way to go from now on. We need to build models that are what are called second order chaotic models, which are constantly looking at a changing environment and making predictions and changes as they go. And it's like the stock market. So if I could take the historic data of the stock market, if I could predict whether a stock is going to go up or down, I then build a model that makes decisions in that world. Now, what happens is, because that's a new entity in the stock market that never existed in the past, that's changing the stock market, all of my historic data is redundant. So these are called second order chaotic problems, and so we should be approaching it, either humans or machines, in this way.
That makes sense. No, that's fascinating. I guess one of the areas I've been looking at as part of this exercise is, given the reasons of the future feels, as glib as it sounds, more uncertain, or at least as uncertain, the more uncertain. And I guess organisations, particularly boards, are looking at, I guess, a broader definition of value that they're looking to sort of maximise beyond shareholder value. You know, the concepts of responsible capitalism, in terms of their impact on the environment, on society, much more, and perhaps taking a longer term view. And hence, having a clearer view and capability around, if you like, foresight, and being more capable around it, is more central to strategy than perhaps the one-off exercises you tend to do just to sort of sprinkle a little bit of foresight on top of the existing strategy.
Indeed, no, I totally agree. Yeah, agreed. Sorry, just going to get rid of this little one. Yeah,
we covered a lot of ground. I guess the last question from me is around speed. How important, I mean, a lot of people talk about the benefits of speed, of obviously automation and, I guess, artificial intelligence, particularly in terms of learning, for example, running hundreds and thousands of scenarios rather than running, 5 or 6. When you're speaking with clients in terms of the benefits, how important is the speed, as opposed to obviously value, but how important is the speed aspect to clients?
It's another great question. So if you remember the definition that we use for that's a good definition for intelligence, which is goal-directed adaptive behavior, and that should then form the definition of AI. The ability to adapt is crucial in intelligence. So for me, adaptation is synonymous with intelligence, and in some respects, that word has a degree of how fast can you adapt. Even if you can adapt, it doesn't mean you adapt more quickly than your competitors. And you're absolutely right saying those two words about exploration and exploitation. So I want to, how quickly can I explore the landscape, and then how quickly can I exploit it? And interestingly, our organizational structures are how we operate as companies typically have one model, which is this kind of hierarchical model, which is typically set up to be able to execute very well, not typically set up for exploration. And so what Satalia is trying to do is create a platform for how different ideologies and methodologies can emerge according to the problem that needs solving. So can you operate as a hierarchy to exploit, and can you operate more of as a swarm to explore in different scenarios? So rather than just prescribing one over the other, can you create an architecture for an organization that allows these different ideologies to emerge, thus allowing you to explore and exploit and adapt more quickly than your competitors?
That's fascinating. I'll end on a sort of more, I guess, professionally personal note. Given the speed of, your speed of thought, see how sharp you are, and the challenging market you're in at the moment, but also the great people you work with, where and how do you find time to think perhaps a little bit more deeply about the business life and so on? Where do you find the time?
Well, personally, my brain is a bit weird, and and I'm sure that everybody would say that, but there's a thing that's kind of like bubbling up on the internet at the moment about somebody made a comment on Twitter about not having an internal monologue. So I don't know whether you have an internal monologue, whether you have like a voice or multiple voices in your head that are saying, what should I say? Should I say this? Is this a silly thing to say? Why is he wearing that? All that kind of stuff. It was only in my early 30s, so I don't know whether you have that monologue, but there are people that. Okay, so there are people that don't, and I only realized in my early 30s that people actually had a monologue in their head. So I only realized that you have this voice, and I don't, and there are other people out there that don't, and it can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. But so this is going to sound very strange, but there's nothing much going on in my head. I absorb information, and I kind of sit and wait, and then things emerge. There's no kind of thought process. So my guess is that some stuff is processing in the background, and then things emerge, which don't always go to plan, right? Because it doesn't mean that I'm not sense checking my ideas and things like that. But there is this concept of not having an internal monologue. I don't, and again, it can be an advantage or a disadvantage. So anyway,
I find that I hadn't thought about it deeply, but now you say it, it prompts. Yeah. I do have it sometimes, and other times when I'm probably more relaxed or sort of centered, I will trust myself that I don't need to have it, and things will emerge. Then the challenge, and I'd be interested. The challenge is if something pops into your head, whether it's in your own time or working as a team and so on. How do you then have some structure? So I know people similar to that who actually need either another part of themselves to kick in and say, right, let's structure it, or they have literally somebody guiding them through. They don't want to lose the idea or the thought or the provocation, but they need somebody next to them sort of structuring them to say, okay, let's work out when and how.
Execute, yeah. I think people would say that I don't really execute, but I do execute, but I'm more of a strategist than an executioner. But so yeah, it's probably lacked in Satalia. But to answer your original question, I spend most of my day doing meetings and things like that, and then at the weekends and the evenings, I stare at a blank wall and hope that interesting things emerge.